Welcome back to Anatomiqa. In this session, we will be discussing the details of development of different parts of the tongue and its congenital anomalies. The learning objectives of this session are: describe the development of the tongue, describe the developmental basis of congenital anomalies of the tongue. To understand the development of tongue, we should know the components of pharyngeal apparatus. This picture is the floor of pharynx. The dorsal wall of the pharynx is removed to show the ventral wall from inside. We are seeing the inner surface of the ventral wall of the developing pharynx. The inner surface of the pharynx is lined by the endoderm. The middle portion is formed by the mesoderm and the outer surface is covered by the ectoderm. By the end of the 4 weeks, a median triangular elevation appears in the floor of the primordial pharynx, just rostral to the foramen cecum, called median lingual swelling or the tuberculum impar. To know about foramen cecum, watch the video on development of the thyroid gland. Formation of the median lingual swelling is the first indication of the development of tongue. Soon there will be formation of 2 lateral lingual swellings on either side of the median lingual swelling. These 3 swellings originate from the proliferation of the mesenchyme of the first pharyngeal arch in its ventromedial part. The lateral lingual swellings rapidly increase in size and overgrow the tuberculum impar and merge with each other. In further development, the swellings enlarges and form into anterior 2/3 or body or oral part of the tongue. The plane of fusion of the 2 lateral swellings is indicated superficially by the midline groove of the tongue and internally by the fibrous lingual septum. The tuberculum impar does not form any recognizable part of the adult tongue. Since the mucosa covering the body of the tongue originates from the first pharyngeal arch, sensory innervation to this area is supplied by the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve. The body of the tongue is separated from the posterior third by a V-shaped groove called the terminal sulcus. A second median swelling called copula is formed by the fusion of the ventromedial parts of the second pharyngeal arches. Caudal to the copula, another eminence called hypobranchial or the hypopharyngeal eminence, which is formed by mesoderm of the 3rd and 4th pharyngeal arches. With further development, the hypopharyngeal eminence overgrows the copula and the copula will disappear. The rostral part of the hypopharyngeal eminence develops into the pharyngeal part of the tongue or the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. The caudal part of the hypobranchial or hypopharyngeal eminence formed by the posterior part of the 4th arch develops into the epiglottis. Immediately behind this swelling is the laryngeal orifice, which is flanked by the arytenoid swellings. Now let us see what are the arches which are involved in the formation of different parts of the tongue on the whole. The lateral and the median lingual swellings derived from first arch goes to form the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. The copula derived from the second arch is submerged by the overgrowth of the 3rd arch and disappears later. The 3rd swelling, hypopharyngeal eminence, develops into 2 parts of the tongue. The cranial or proximal part of hypopharyngeal eminence gives rise to the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, and caudal part of the hypopharyngeal eminence gives rise to epiglottis and vallecula of the tongue. Vallecula is the part present between the posterior 1/3 of the tongue and epiglottis. Behind the hypopharyngeal eminence is the laryngeal orifice, which develops into the laryngeal inlet of the larynx. Between the anterior and posterior parts of the tongue, the line of fusion is indicated by a V-shaped groove. This is called as the terminal sulcus or the sulcus terminalis. The midpoint of the terminal sulcus is called the foramen cecum, marked by the cranial opening of the thyroglossal duct, which will be dealt in the development of thyroid gland. Please watch the video on the development of thyroid gland. Till now, we discussed how the mucosa of the different parts of the tongue developed. Coming to the development of the rest of the components of the tongue, let us see from where they develop. The connective tissue and the blood vessels of the tongue develops from the mesenchyme of the pharyngeal arches. The intrinsic muscles of the tongue are derived from myoblasts that migrate from occipital somites. The hypoglossal nerve accompanies the myoblasts during their migration and innervates the tongue muscles as they develop. The lingual papillae appear by the end of the 8th week. They are filiform, fungiform, foliate and circumvallate papillae. The circumvallate papillae and foliate papillae appear first close to the terminal branches of the glossopharyngeal nerve. The fungiform papillae appear later near the terminations of the cauda tympani branch of facial nerve. Filiform papillae, the most common papillae, develop during the early fetal period by about 10 to 11 weeks. They contain afferent nerve endings of the lingual nerve that are sensitive to touch. Taste buds develop during 11 to 13 weeks by inductive interaction between the epithelial cells of the tongue and invading gustatory nerve cells from the cauda tympani, glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves. Facial responses in the fetus can be induced by bitter tasting substances at 26 to 28 weeks, indicating that reflex pathways between the taste buds and facial muscles are established by this stage. Coming to the nerve supply of the tongue, the sensory supply to the mucosa of almost the entire anterior 2/3 or oral part of the tongue, derived from first pharyngeal arch, is from lingual branch of the mandibular division of trigeminal nerve, which is the nerve of the first arch. The cauda tympani branch of the facial nerve supplies the taste buds in the anterior part of the tongue except for the circumvallate papillae. Because the second arch component, copula, is overgrown by the third arch component, that is hypopharyngeal eminence, the facial nerve does not supply the mucosa of the tongue. The posterior 1/3 of the tongue and circumvallate papillae, even if it is present in the anterior 1/3 of the tongue, are derived from the third arch. Both are supplied by the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is the nerve of the third arch. The epiglottis and the extreme posterior part of the tongue, vallecula, are innervated by the superior laryngeal nerve, which is the branch of the vagus, reflecting their development from the fourth arch. The motor supply to the entire tongue muscles except palatoglossus is innervated by the hypoglossal nerve, since they develop from occipital somites. The palatoglossus is supplied by the pharyngeal plexus, by fibers arising from the vagus nerve. So this was the normal development of the tongue. Now let us see the congenital anomalies of the tongue. Normally, cell degeneration occurs extensively and the root of the tongue is anchored to the floor of the mouth by a mucosal fold called the frenulum. In ankyloglossia or the tongue tie, the tongue is not freed from the floor of the mouth. In the most common form of ankyloglossia, the frenulum extends to the tip of the tongue. Congenital macroglossia, which is large tongue, can be observed in many syndromes like Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome, Down syndrome, Crouzon syndrome, idiopathic muscular hypertrophy, adenoid hyperplasia, hemangioma and lymphangioma. Microglossia is an extremely rare developmental condition having decreased length and width of the tongue. This might lead to abnormal respiratory, feeding and speech functions. Aglossia is the complete absence of the tongue. Bifid tongue has two tips. This might be because of non-fusion of the two lateral lingual swellings. Lingual thyroid is formed when the thyroid tissue is arrested under the mucosa or in the muscles of the tongue. Thyroglossal duct cyst occurs when the remnants of the thyroglossal duct remains at the base of the tongue. This is called as the lingual cyst. With this, we have completed the development of the tongue and its congenital anomalies. Thank you for watching till the end. If you like the video, like, share and subscribe to the channel. It will help the other students who are in need.